All right, well, let's get started. I don't think today's lecture will go very long. I'm always promising that, but this time I think it's really true because it's actually a pretty succinct chapter. This part 2 of looking at the insurance contract has just really 2 sections with content. The first one just walks through the steps of entering into a contract, what that entails. And then we talk about the contract itself. And we're really referencing the contract in general because every type of insurance has a slightly different look to the contract. Because some policies can be very succinct. A life insurance policy doesn't necessarily have to be nearly as long or detailed as maybe an auto policy or a homeowner's policy, because an auto and homeowner's policy, as we'll learn in future chapters, is what's called a multi-risk policy, whereas life insurance is pretty straightforward. It's maybe the simplest insurance coverage there is. But we'll walk through those, and we're going to use the umbrella policy as an example of a contract, because I happen to have an umbrella policy that we can get through in enough detail that I think it'll help drive home some of these different sections of the contract. So let's start with the very basics of entering into a contract. Whether you buy insurance online or you buy it through a human being, you're going to complete an application, especially your first introduction to this company. If they've never met you before, you just maybe bought your first automobile, you've got to go out and buy coverage. You're either going to do it online with an application or you're going to meet with somebody in person. Almost all insurance companies now are doing things electronically, even if you are dealing with them in person. And so you'll complete the application, and depending upon the kind of coverage you're purchasing, they may give you a binder. And this binder will indicate whether or not you have coverage that minute or if it's conditional. So again, you have immediate coverage with a general binder, and you have conditional coverage with a conditional binder that will not be enforced unless the underwriter approves it. With a general binder, you're covered right there. If the underwriter later decides that you don't meet the definition, they'll cancel coverage in the future, but you've at least walked out of that office or you've logged off of that website with a binder of some sort if you get a general binder, so that you know you're driving away with some kind of coverage until you hear otherwise. Now with life insurance, you may or may not get a binder issued right away. It depends. If they offer it to you, let's say you apply for $1 million worth of life insurance. You've decided it's important for you to have this coverage, and you want to get it done right away because you're about to go on a trip and you're afraid that something bad is going to happen while you're away. So you meet with an insurance agent. They complete the application with you, and it seems like everything should be fine. You know, you didn't have any issues. So the agent takes the application, you pay your first premium, and then you're going to get one of two things. Either a conditional receipt, which is likely to be what you'd get if you applied for a whole lot of coverage. If you walked into that office and applied, for example, like for $5 million worth of coverage, they might not be willing to give it to you right on the spot. But let's say you walked into the office and asked for $100,000 worth of coverage and paid the premium. They might bind it and maybe later reject your application, but you've at least walked out of the office with coverage in effect as of that date, even though the underwriter hasn't officially received the application yet. Because remember, the agent is the go-between. The agent is the gateway between you and the company. The agent might have binding authority. And for certain amounts of coverage and for certain risks, they can actually guarantee you coverage walking out of that office. But later, it's possible the underwriter might discover something in your medical records that they say, you know what, we're actually really not comfortable with this, and either not offer you coverage or maybe change the offer and say, fine, we'll offer it to you, but it turns out you've got type 1 diabetes and we're not going to issue this policy as applied for. But if you died between the time you completed the application and the time that you heard back from the underwriter, there would be coverage under this binding receipt scenario, regardless of whether or not the underwriter approved it. A conditional receipt says, look, you'll only be covered in this weird purgatory that you're in from the time that you apply until the time you're approved. The only way you're covered there is if we approve you at the end. If it turns out that you are approved, we'll retroactively put that policy in place as of the date that you applied for it. However, if we decline the coverage at the end, because let's say we discovered again that you had diabetes of some sort or whatever condition made you uninsurable, then even if you died in between of like you just got hit by a truck, you are not covered if the underwriter wasn't going to issue the policy based on your underwriting details or on your application information. So when it comes to applying for insurance, understanding the type of binder that you're walking away with is important. Now, once you have a relationship with an insurance company, especially when it comes to home and auto, you'll likely be able to just make a phone call and get an oral approval or an oral binder from an agent. A verbal binder is as good as a written binder as long as you document it. And documentation is everything when it comes to insurance and your insurance discussions. Now, because everything's done online, you can find documentation almost anywhere. And you'll get in the habit, if you're not already, of documenting everything either via email or with a text. You're always looking for some kind of electronic documentation of a discussion, especially when there was a question of coverage or adding coverage. So that's the application and binder section. Let's do a quick quiz. Okay, are you guys ready? The conditional receipt, true or false? The conditional receipt does not bind the coverage of life insurance at the time it is issued. Is that true or false? I'm seeing some nods. It is true, it does not. A general binder issues the insurance at the time, or it binds the coverage at the time it's issued if it's a general. But if it's a conditional, we've got to wait until the underwriter approves it. A claim for the death benefit under a binding receipt will be paid if, so again, a claim for the death benefit under a binding receipt will be paid if death occurs prior to the issuance of the policy and the insurer's right to deny is waived because of the agent's consent to the insured, or death occurs while one's application for life insurance is being processed, even if the deceased is found not to be insurable, or death occurs prior to issuance of policy, but only if the insured was insurable when he or she applied. And then finally, the individual is found to be insurable and death occurs after the policy is delivered. A claim for the death benefit under a binding receipt will be paid if, which one of those is true? So Austin, you think it's the first one. Death occurs prior to issuance of the policy and the insurer's right to deny is waived because of the agent's consent to the insured. That's partially true, but the reason why the death claim would be paid isn't because anything was waived. There wasn't a waiver here. The agent had binding authority. And so it involves the piece of this that's important, especially when it comes to a binding receipt, is whether or not the insured is found to be insurable. So if the death occurs while one's application for life insurance is being processed, even if the deceased is found not to be insurable. Because what we're saying is, look, you're trusting us, we'll get our underwriting done. You're applying for a reasonable amount of coverage. There wasn't anything fishy in the application, at least when we took it. We want you to be confident and we want you to like our company. So we're going to do you this solid and we're going to issue you a binder And hopefully everything will go well during underwriting, but if it doesn't, you've at least had 30 or 60 days worth of coverage using this binder. So no right was waived there. Blank is an offer to buy insurance. Which of these is an offer to buy insurance? Rachel, what do you think? Application. Yep, application. We didn't talk about this in lecture. It's covered in this first section, but I bet you could think your way through it. With cancelable policies, the insurer is not responsible for losses that occur prior to cancellation. How about my future lawyer? What do you think of that one? With cancelable policies, the insurer is not responsible for losses that occur prior to cancellation. True or false? It's sort of a logic question, isn't it? Yeah, prior. You better cover those. All right, that's it for that one. All right, so the next section is all about the different parts of the insurance contract. And yes, it's true, it doesn't sound that exciting, but we're gonna try to make it exciting because we're gonna talk about this case and we're gonna relate the coverage and the parts of the policy that would apply somewhat to this case. And I may have mentioned this before. This happened in Madison in 2015, where a young man was on his way to work. He worked at Land's End, driving his vehicle, when he hit a woman who was biking to work at Epic. She had been on the bike path and had pulled onto the road in front of the driver, Brian Hodgson, who's my client's brother. And Brian hit her. She lived for a few days, ultimately died. And the police who investigated the accident didn't issue any tickets because it was unclear if the bicyclist had stopped before entering the road. And the view was obstructed because there was overgrown trees and bushes, et cetera. But this is just a horrifying accident. I'm sure it was horrifying for Brian, regardless of whether or not he was found to be at fault. I'm anticipating, I'm sort of projecting that it would be a really, 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 really bad thing to have happen, fault or not. But what makes it even worse is that despite not being found responsible for the accident, at least by the police, the parents of the young woman who was killed sued. They hired an attorney who specializes in accidents involving bicycles and was able ultimately to get a jury verdict for more than $15 million. This $10 million for loss of society and companionship is well beyond the limit that's allowed in the state of Wisconsin, so that was knocked down, but there was a $5 million award for pain, suffering, and mental anguish, which did not get knocked down. So ultimately, the award was for over $5 million. I'd never seen a claim like this when I was working claims back in the day when I dealt with, gory car accident claims. And when I became aware of this particular claim, I just really, it made a big impression on me. I told the story to all my clients and I explained to them why hopefully something like this will never happen. But if it does, you're going to want to make sure you have enough insurance in place to cover the loss. Brian Hodgson had about $100,000 worth of liability coverage in place, which in my opinion isn't enough. If you're going to be driving around, great big vehicle, even a small vehicle, screaming down the highway at 70 miles an hour, you could do a lot of damage with that to either, people in your own car or people in other vehicles. And $100,000 bodily injury liability limit doesn't go very far, especially if somebody has a permanent injury or is killed. So Brian will, if he hasn't filed bankruptcy already, which I'm sure he has, I tried to get an update on this case by looking at the Wisconsin Circuit Court records. I know his wife's wages are being garnished. He has since quit his job and he's working on his own. He's pretty much lost everything. Even though much of what you own can be protected, your primary residence can be protected, your retirement accounts can be protected, he had significant assets that to him were significant, including rental properties. And his own 401k, he unwisely drained to help pay for his own defense, which he didn't need. He had an insurance company to pay for that for him. So he made some mistakes, obviously, in a lot of different ways. But this is, to me, this is a case that really underscores the need for coverage. So I think it's helpful to use it as an example of, when we look at a contract, we're going to look at a personal liability umbrella policy, and we're going to use it to help illustrate what these different pieces of the contract are. And let me just pull this. And if I can do this side by side, let's give that a whirl. So I'll have you, if you haven't already opened up under Module 6, the sample personal liability umbrella policy. And we're going to talk about the different parts of the policy. And I'm, of course, using State Farm's. I can't help myself. And just as a quick primer, what is a personal liability umbrella policy? So here's what Brian needed. Brian had his car. And on his car, he had $100,000 worth of bodily injury liability. And this is per accident, or per person per accident. Per person per accident. And if you look in your own wallet at what your coverage is, you'll see how much liability coverage you carry on your car. And he also had, there's additional limits of $300,000 personal injury bodily injury liability coverage per loss. So this means that if you were to max it out, maybe there were 10 people hurt and they each had significant injuries, the most any one of them is going to get is $100,000 from the auto policy, and the entire accident under his policy, all of the bodily injuries were going to be no more than $300,000. That's the limit that the company was going to pay. That is not the limit that you could be held responsible for, but that's the limit the insurance company for him was going to pay. There was also another limit, $50,000 for property damage liability, which is rarely, I mean, first of all, $50,000 worth of property damage liability nowadays is nothing. I don't know what a Tesla costs, but I can't get very far in this town without seeing one. So anyhow, so those are the liability coverages on a car, which is, of all the coverages you're going to carry on a car, those are the ones I care about the most. Your comp and collision, which we'll cover in future chapters, for the damage to the car itself are important, but that's not going to ruin you. If you had a total loss with your car and you didn't have coverage, that would suck, but it is not going to bankrupt you. A bad liability claim will take you down for a long time. It's going to take Brian Hodgson right into oblivion. I can't believe his marriage has survived the stress of this, much less financially how he's going to recover. Anyhow, so your auto policy provides these limits, hooray, but it's not enough. And most people want more. Most people that have something to insure, they have their future earnings to insure, especially, because that's really, for a young person, what they're really risking is that their wages will be garnished forever, right? Hold on, I gotta make this smaller. So if you want, you can add additional liability coverage. Let's say you have a number of cars. Let's project out 10 years into the future. you've got, maybe you're married, maybe you've got a couple of cars, maybe you own a house, and you want to add extra liability coverage on top of all of them. So you buy an umbrella policy. And maybe you add one with $1 million limits, but actually nowadays I like at least 2. And that $2 million umbrella policy sits on top of all of your other liability coverages, your cars, maybe you've got more than one, and your house, maybe you're renting, it would sit on top of your renter's policy. Again, for liability coverage, losses that you are responsible for, not damage to your own property, but losses to others that you could be sued for. Now, when you buy an umbrella policy, they require that you have underlying limits, because the deal they're making with you is, oh, that's right, I'm changing this to 2 million. You know, in this case, it's State Farm. State Farm says, look, Lisa, we'll let you have your $2 million umbrella policy, but that umbrella policy isn't going to kick in until you burn through your underlying limits on your other policies. And on your auto policy, I'm going to require you to carry at least $250,000 worth of liability coverage per person, $500,000 per accident, and I don't remember what the property damage one is. I think it's $100,000 that they require. And this is their underlying limit requirement. And on my home, I have to cover at least $300,000 worth of liability coverage. What do you think is the most common liability claim from a homeowner's policy? Who wants to guess? What do you think drives, what is the most common awful liability claim from a homeowner's policy? Anybody? I'll give you a clue. 4 legs. Dogs. Dog bites. Dogs. Anyhow. So if you have a dog bite claim, that can be a problem. So anyways, your homeowner's policy is generally not going to be the source of that many claims. It's your car. Driving around presents the biggest risk for any of us. So that umbrella policy sits on top of all of these. So essentially, instead of having just $250,000 worth of coverage on your auto, you have $2,250,000 worth of coverage. So when we look at the policy details, let's do a side-by-side with the agreement, or well, let's start with the declarations, because any contract in general has 5 sections. The declarations, the insuring clauses, the beloved exclusions, which are perhaps the most important part of a policy. You don't know what you have coverage for until you know what's excluded. The conditions or duties of the insured. And then finally, any endorsements or riders that were added to the policy. That isn't necessarily going to be a part of everybody's policy, but it's possible that there's an endorsement or a rider that applies to yours. That's just sort of a tack on. So back when I went to claims school and I had to learn the ins and outs of the State Farm auto policy, the policy itself starts below this line. It's everything in this box, right? So when you study and take a test on what's covered and what's not covered, everything in that red box, that's what doesn't change unless they make a revision to the policy. But no matter who you are, you're buying this promise, this contract. The declarations portion is very specific to you and the thing that you're insuring. So the declarations is pretty much the who. Who are we insuring? Is it you and maybe somebody else? Is it you and a spouse, you and a partner? Is it your organization that's the named insured? Because of course, insurance isn't, we're going to look at an umbrella policy today, but these contracts could be for life insurance, disability insurance, auto, home, business, workers' comp, health. And so all of these pieces apply to those contracts. It's also going to tell you the period of coverage. When does coverage begin? And what period will your premium cover you through? Most auto policies are 6-month policies. I don't know why that is. It's so dumb. They should just make it 1 year. Just like your homeowners is usually a 1-year period. It also lists the exposures to be covered. Is this a homeowner's auto policy? What is it? And then, of course, we also have the limits of liability. And that word, unfortunately, we're using it in 2 different ways in this section. Really what we're saying is, what is the limit of coverage? Because that term liability has a very specific meaning. I just went ape talking about this liability loss that this guy had. He was liable for the damage he did to this bicyclist and ultimately to her family that sued him. So that was a liability claim. And there is liability coverage for that claim. But there's also, you know, coverage on your home. You've got limits on your home of a certain amount. If you've got life insurance, you've got a death benefit amount. So when we talk about limitations, that's really what we're referring to is what is the maximum the policy is going to pay for this thing that we're insuring for you. And then of course, it's going to spell out what is your part of this? What is your deductible or co-insurance that you're going to be responsible for dealing with? We're all familiar with it on health insurance, for example. You got to pay your co-pays and deductibles. Not every policy has a retainer. Life insurance doesn't usually have a deductible, you know. So the declarations changes with the client. The rest of it does not. And in the sample that I have up, the declarations, because this is a sample policy, it just generically, it's telling us that that is where your name and your mailing address and the policy period would go. But the rest of it is the actual agreement. And you'll notice that the policy that I'm using as an example, the sections that we're going to cover, the insuring clauses, are actually just one page, page 6. So let's go there. Let's see the agreement, which is sort of funny. I mean, it starts on page 1 and it continues, but there's, let's talk about what does it mean, these insuring clauses. Because the insuring clauses is essentially the generic promise that the company is making. And I say generic because most policies are gonna say, look, here's what we're covering. Generally speaking, we're providing you insurance for X. But be sure to read the exclusions to see everything that's not. And that's what's called an open perils policy, as opposed to a named perils policy, which is a very limiting thing to have. When we get to the homeowner section, we'll talk a lot more about open peril, which is good. You kind of want open peril versus named peril. Named peril policies are used when you have a piece of property that's substandard, that we really want to limit the things that we're going to insure it against. And so for this purpose, for the promise portion of it, the insuring clause tells us what perils are covered, and it's going to be varied depending upon the kind of policy that you're purchasing. And then we're going to also list what is the exposure to loss. So in this personal liability policy agreement, you can see that State Farm is agreeing to provide insurance as described later in the policy based on whether or not I pay my premium and if I comply with all their provisions, which they're about to tell me what they are, and they're going to rely on my truthfulness. So this is a little bit of both agreement and conditions all at the same time. And again, they want me to agree that I'll pay my damn premium. I'll tell them everything I need to in the application, and that I'll be truthful about it. And oh, by the way, when I request changes to my policy, they might change the premium and I owe that too. And number 4 tells us that my policy consists of not just this policy booklet, but also the declarations page and any endorsement. So be sure to read all of it, which nobody ever does. And then what's not listed in the book, but is provided by most policies, is this long list of definitions. These definitions go on and on. And while I'm sort of rolling my eyes over how many definitions there are, the truth is you really are going to need them, because once you start digging into this policy, you will refer back to these definitions frequently. I'm not going to read all these definitions to you, but I do want you to pay attention to how many things seem intuitive but need to be explained. For example, what is a bodily injury? Why, it's physical injury, sickness, or disease, including death resulting from it. What does it not include? Well, any of the following. Diseases, bacteria, parasites, virus, any organism that's transmitted by an insured to another person. Well, even though this is just the definition section, you can already, they're foreshadowing what's not covered. Now, again, we're just in the definition section of this policy, but the definitions are very, very helpful, especially since you know that this is a personal liability umbrella policy. It is not intended to cover business activities. So you can see how we've got some definitions in here around what business activities include and what business property includes. Also, this term, personal injury. You're like, wait a minute, didn't we just talk about that? Isn't personal injury bodily injury? Well, no, it's not actually. Personal injury includes false arrest, false imprisonment, wrongful eviction, wrongful detention of a person, abusive process, malicious prosecution, libel, slander, defamation of character, yada, yada, yada. So a lot of definitions. We'll come back to these potentially. But let's get to maintaining required underlying insurance. Here's another requirement of the policy, which is a blending of what we have over on this side of the, part of the conditions, but also part of the retained losses. You are required to maintain underlying insurance in order to have this policy stay in force. And there's all sorts of requirements about what happens if you don't have that required underlying coverage in force. Little side note, by the way, if you're ever working with a client and they have their autos with one company, their home with another, and an umbrella with a third, that's not a good idea. I mean, if you're going to have this coverage, you kind of want it to all be coordinated with one company. And just reading this policy should scare you into making sure that for sure you want the you want the auto and the umbrella to be with the same insurance company. You don't want them pointing fingers about who owes what. Okay, finally we get to the coverages. So this is really the insuring clause or part of it. So coverage L, personal liability. If a claim is made or suit is brought against an insured, that could be you. So see how insured is bolded. Of course, you can go back to the definitions to see who qualifies as an insured. Because if it's you that's listed, but you also have maybe a 16-year-old kid living at home, they might also be considered an insured as well. It depends on the definition of insured. So if a claim is made or suit is brought against an insured for damages, that is, dollars that you owe because of a loss for which you are legally liable, you don't have to be sued to be liable. If I rear end you and I do a lot of damage to your car and a lot of damage to you, I'm negligent and I'm liable for your damage. You don't have to sue me to get money. You can just ask. And my insurance company will be dying to just pay you to make you go away. Because nobody wants to go to court. I shouldn't say that. Most people don't want to go to court. All right, so for which you're legally liable and to which this policy applies. We will pay on behalf of the insured the damages that exceed the retained limit. So they're saying if you have a bad enough accident, you nutball, and it goes beyond your $250,000 worth of coverage that you have on your car, we'll pay the damage, we'll pay the rest of the damage up to our policy limit of $2 million. And oh, by the way, the next section, defense. They'll also pay separately to defend me, and there's no stated limit for that. So State Farm's going to hire their own lawyers, and they're actually pretty good, to defend me and technically them, because they don't want to pay a lot. And if they can avoid paying a fortune under my umbrella policy, they'll get good legal defense to protect me against, hopefully, a terrible claim. So that's really the promise that they're making. Those 2 paragraphs are the entire promise, generically speaking, for what this policy is going to provide. The peril here and the exposure, the perils it's liability, and the exposure, legal defense, and the cost to pay for the damage that I might do with my car, my house, or me with my mouth or my words. Those are all part of the coverage. They have all sorts of rights. You're signing away your rights in some ways when you buy insurance, because if you want them to protect you, they have the right to investigate, negotiate, and settle any claim. So let's say what you're sued for is something embarrassing. Maybe you were leaving your boyfriend or girlfriend's house in the middle of the night, and you were in such a hurry to get home to your spouse, you crossed the center line when you had this bad accident. The insurance company is absolutely going to investigate that. And there might be things that are determined that are maybe embarrassing to you that you don't want out. And if you get in the way of that investigation, they can deny coverage. So what they're saying is, look, we have the right to investigate, negotiate, and settle these claims if we decide that it's appropriate. Their duty is to defend me, but they will do it in their way, not in my way. I don't get to call the shots, they do. And if there's additional coverage in place, then they'll coordinate that. Okay, so let's start looking at these exclusions, because that's really where the interesting parts of this contract and most contracts apply. And this is where insurance companies get a bad name, because they're like, yeah, it feels like insurance companies just are looking for ways to not pay. And I'll tell you, part of that is because most of us don't have the bandwidth, the blood sugar, and the attention to detail to read one of these policies. They're a little boring. But I want you to find me one exclusion that's listed that makes perfect sense to you. Find an exclusion listed in this policy that you think, well, duh, that is totally reasonable. I'll give you a minute. And as soon as you find one, either raise your hand or just holler. Again, this is a personal liability umbrella policy. Put yourself in the shoes of the insurance company. One about nuclear reaction. What? Oh, there we go. Radiation or radioactive contamination from any source. So if I'm, I guess that doesn't exactly, we should see if this would apply, but if any of you have watched Breaking Bad, when Jesse was cooking meth in the basement. Did anybody see Breaking Bad? You guys really need to watch Breaking Bad. Anyhow, that would probably also not be a covered loss. But yes, because why do you suppose that would be excluded? The damage would be, yeah, it's really difficult to assess, like how likely is that to occur, and what would the cost be? They just don't have enough data. Anybody see anything else that seems pretty obvious that you would want to exclude? Well, these are all exclusions to the exclusions to coverage, because this policy is saying, look, we're going to protect you if you are sued and liable for injuries or damage to others. Just generically speaking, that's what the whole point of this personal liability umbrella policy is. Now we have all of these exclusions that are sort of limiting it to really what it's trying to do is really just get to personal exposures. The minute we start adding in, how about just this first one? The loss involving any insured's maintenance, use, ownership, loading, or unloading of any farm tractors. I mean, if you're a farmer, you better get your own policy for your farm to cover your risk, because I don't want my own personal liability umbrella policy that covers me and my pathetically small liability exposures in my little life, to be affected price-wise by a farmer. If I'm going to be put in the same pool with people that are farming, my premium is going to skyrocket. So that guy better get his own coverage, is what I say as a client. And for an umbrella policy, in order to accurately assess the risk, we sure don't want to be insuring, again, farmers or, you know, people who are unloading aircraft. I mean, how many of you are unloading aircraft right now for, you know, your personal life? Nobody. I mean, maybe. I want to hear about it. Or how about this? A loss arising out of alleged or actual sexual harassment, sexual molestation, or discrimination prohibited by law. Yeah, we're not going to cover that, you knucklehead. Don't break the law. We don't cover that kind of stuff. A loss arising out of any insured's act or omission as a member of a corporation's board of directors, they will let you have coverage for that in the event that it's a non-for-profit. So if you're just like helping out with some local organization, that's fine, but not if it's a paid position in a company that you're working for. So again, a lot of these exclusions are, I mean, total, in my opinion, but again, I'm an insurance nut, they seem reasonable. So when you read these exclusions, though, they're pretty important to understand what you are and are not covered for. Especially, again, business pursuits. You have a lot of people who are doing all of these side gigs. They're either renting out their homes for Airbnb, they're, you know, driving for Grubhub or whatever. You know, you've got maybe some independent contractor activities that you've taken on. That is not covered under a personal liability umbrella policy. And there's probably exclusions around those activities on your auto policy. So the moment you start to mix business and personal coverage, you definitely want to take a look at what the exclusions include. So those are just some of the examples for why you see exclusions. But when you look at the list of things that might be excluded, it's not just, you know, we talk about activities that are excluded. Some policies might exclude coverage at certain locations. Like if you try to drive your car across the border into Mexico and think that you've got coverage, you probably don't. You have to read your policy, but most will cut you off the moment you get more than 50 miles over the border into Mexico. It's like no more coverage. Other perils that might be excluded, like mold, or for property coverage. If you have a homeowner's policy and your car is parked in the garage when your house burns down, your homeowner's policy excludes coverage on the car. Your homeowner's policy isn't going to pay for the car if it burns up. You need auto coverage for that. And then certain losses aren't covered. For example, if you've got a health insurance policy, it might say, look, we're going to cover, you know, your injuries, but we're not going to cover the cost of elective cosmetic surgery. So exclusions can run the gamut of those general categories. And then, of course, you've got this condition section, which in the State Farm policy, it's a mix of duties and conditions. And these, let's talk about the duties, because I think they're a little bit more interesting. Okay, they're slightly interesting. The moment you have a loss, you need to tell your insurance company that this happened. Many times people are afraid. They're like, oh, I don't want to tell them. I'm afraid if I tell them, it's just automatically going to raise my rates. Well, it might, but I'd rather have your rates be raised and you get to keep your coverage than for you to fail to report and then breach your contract, because you have a duty to notify the insurance company immediately of a loss. The faster you tell them about the whatever the situation was, the faster they can respond and likely deal with it and settle it for a more reasonable amount than if, you know, this other person that you've hurt just sits and stews over it for months before anybody contacts them. You also have a duty to provide information about any lawsuits that are filed. So if you receive a summons and complaint, Rachel, did you have a question?
Yeah, it's, well, Well, one of the questions on the homework was like the family's like house gets hit by a tree and then they leave for the night, and the insurance company, then if their house gets like stolen from, and the insurance company won't cover the theft, is it because they didn't tell them right away?
It's because they had a duty to protect their property.
Okay.
So it's one of the requirements is once you do have a loss, and it's not going to be listed in this umbrella policy as an example. The question, by the way, for you guys, I don't know if you could hear it online, was from the homework, when the family's house gets hit by a tree and they take off, I don't remember where they went, but they leave. And while they're gone and their home is blown open from this tree, somebody robs them and the insurance company doesn't cover it. And that's because they have a duty to protect their property. If they go to expense, if they incur an expense to protect their property, that expense is a covered loss. So the insurance company wants you to throw a tarp over the roof. If it's, if your roof collapses due to the weight of ice and snow, so that it prevents additional damage. So those are the duties, and the conditions include all of these other things, especially when it comes to an umbrella policy. It's not as interesting as it would be for an auto policy. But they're essentially saying that we have these additional conditions, which might include, if you file bankruptcy, that doesn't absolve them from covering the claim. They might decide to appeal an award. If there's a legal decision, they might not like it and they might want to keep going, and they have that right to do that. Along with all of these others. We won't go through all of these different conditions of this particular policy, but those are some examples. So notifying of a loss, cooperating is one of your duties, and protecting property after a loss. And there aren't any endorsements to this particular sample policy, but many of them would have an endorsement. Property and casualty policies have endorsements. Life and health policies have riders. I don't know why that difference arose, but it did. So that's the contract in a nutshell.